Welcome to 101, a podcast for young women interested in careers in film and TV.
We'll sit down with industry professionals, ask them your questions, and get the answers you need to know.
101. It's a beginning.
Hi, everybody. We are so excited to be here today with Patty Lin. Patty, I'm not going to lie. I am trying not to fangirl on you because Meredith and I have been reading your book. It is just so spectacular. And, there are so many things that I love about it. I love your voice. I love the way you share things. I think everyone should buy and read your book. Anyone that's interested in the industry, anyone that's interested in watching things in the industry and knowing how things are made, I just think it's so important. So thank you for that. Thank you for being with us on 101. I guess we're just going to kind of jump in because nobody wants to hear me talk. They want to hear you talk. How did you get started in the industry?
Well, I just want to say thank you for that amazing endorsement of the book. I really, really appreciate all of that. I grew up in the Midwest. I was a latchkey kid. My parents were Taiwanese immigrants. They both worked full time. And so I would, watch TV for hours and hours every day after school. And I think that was kind of like the very beginning because I just really absorbed all of that TV and just it became like part of my DNA in a way, even though at that point, I had no idea that I was going to end up working in entertainment. I didn't even know that that was a career. It was so far removed from my experience. So yeah, I didn't dream about that as a child, but eventually when I got to college, I actually went to college for thinking that I was going to go into advertising. And that was kind of my way of, trying to take all of these, sort of creative talents that I had and try to make them into a job that would actually be able to that I would be able to make a living at. I went home for Christmas break and a friend of mine and I went to New York to go see the Letterman Show because we were huge fans of that show. And we didn't realize that you had to buy tickets. You had to get tickets way in advance. We just showed up thinking that we were going to be able to just get in. And we started talking to an NBC page in the lobby to see if we could get tickets. And I just started talking to him about his job because I was curious. He was really the first person I had ever met who worked in the business. And he didn't have any showbiz connections or anything like that. And that's when I realized that normal people could do this job. And so I started asking him, well, how would somebody get an internship at the Letterman Show? Because I knew that they had college interns because Dave talked about it on the show sometimes. And so this page, who, by the way, I ended up dating for 10 years. That's another story that's in the book. He told me, you just write a letter to the producer and tell them you want to be an intern. And I thought it can't possibly be that easy, but it was. I just wrote a letter. I got called in to interview and I got a summer internship there. And I just fell in love with it immediately. It was so cool to be working on this show that I idolized and to be able to do things that actually contributed to the making of the show. A lot of the stuff we did was grunt work, just running around doing errands for people and stuff. But I worked as a research intern. So I would research the guests that were coming on the show. And then I would sometimes come up with questions that Dave could ask in the interviews. And sometimes they would even get in the script. So,
nice.
That was a really early kind of taste of television writing, even though I wasn't a writer at the time, or TV writer at the time. That was probably the most exciting thing to me was to have a hand in the making of the show.
I wonder how that's changed since then. I wonder how that has evolved. I think it has quite significantly, actually.
Yeah, did you find the address? Did you just write a letter directly to the address of the studio, or how do you even find that information at that point in time?
Not sure how I figured it out, but I already knew who the executive producer was. It was Robert Morton, Morty, because they talked about him on the show. You know what I mean? He kind of a bit of a public figure. And so I just addressed the letter to him. And, the show at the time was at 30 Rock, it was in the 30 Rock building. And I just sent it there, and they had a system where they just, I guess combed through all of these letters from college students and brought them in. I mean, they employed a lot of interns. So they needed a lot of people to come in, and it was a completely unpaid position.
As many are. Can you give our listeners just kind of like a trajectory of how your career evolved? And then I'd love to kind of then touch on your book.
Yeah. So after I did a couple of internships at Letterman, when I graduated, I went to work there full time. They had just moved to CBS, and that was very fortunate for me because that meant like they had a bunch of new job openings. I wanted to do something creative, but the job that was offered to me was in the accounting department. It was assistant to the production manager. It was like, okay, I'll just do this. And, eventually I'll be able to move on to a different department and maybe something a little bit more creative. So I took that job and ended up doing that for 4 years. And during that time, I had tried to move into a different position, like when there was an opening for a researcher, I applied for that, but I didn't make it into any of these other departments. And I think part of that was this kind of pigeonholing process that would happen. Once you started in one position, nobody really could see you doing anything else. After 4 years of working in accounting, where I just had this horrible boss and it was just a nightmare, I decided I had to get out, I had to do something else. And so I started writing spec scripts in my free time. I decided that I wanted to write for television, but I didn't want to write for Letterman because I didn't consider myself to be a comedy writer, and I wasn't a joke writer. I wanted to write shows that were relationship dramas. Growing up, I loved 30 something. That was my favorite show when I was in high school, which is so weird because I was, 15, 16 years old, and I was obsessed with the show about 30 something baby boomers, but it was a great show. It was really well written, just loved the characters, and they did a lot of sort of groundbreaking stuff in that show, just with the form. And I loved it. And so that's what I was aspiring to do. I wanted to write stuff like that. I knew that I had to get an agent, if I was going to do this. So in order to get an agent, I started writing spec scripts. First one I did was My So-Called Life, because that was kind of like,
I love that show.
Such a good show.
So good. For the listeners who don't know what a spec script is, can you just explain briefly for those who don't know?
Yes, a spec script is short for speculative. So a spec script is when you write an episode of an existing show that you're just going to use as a writing sample to show that you know how to write, that you know how to take on the voice of these characters, and that you know how to write in that style. There are other kinds of spec scripts, like if you write a spec pilot, that can actually be used not only as a writing sample, but sometimes people try to sell those and try to get a show made. And I don't know how things have changed since then, but at the time, what you would do is you would write at least 2 spec scripts in order to get an agent. And so the first one I wrote was My So-Called Life, and the second one I wrote was Party of Five. Those were enough to sort of get me a meeting with an agent. And let me also just say that I was dating the guy who was the NBC page. He went on to become a television writer and very successful. And so I was dating him. Let me tell you, that opened a lot of doors. I was very grateful for that, because it's very, very hard when you don't have any connections. Even though I didn't end up with his agent, I met my agent, the person who became my eventual agent. I met him at a party that my boyfriend brought me to, because he was working on Seinfeld at the time. And there were a lot of, the agents came to these parties, and that's where I met her. So I met Sue Nagel from UTA and really hit it off with her. And she said, well, I love your spec scripts. When she read them, she's like, but you need to write something a little bit harder edged, because at the time there really weren't a lot of shows like My So-Called Life or Party of Five. Everything was procedural, at that time. So she's like, you need to write something harder edged. And I didn't really feel like I knew how to do that. The only show that I really loved that was a procedural was The X-Files. So I decided to write one of those. I really struggled with that, but my agent loved it. And then she said, you got to come out to LA if you're serious about writing for TV, because there just weren't that many productions in New York. So then I moved to LA in the late 90s. I got a day job as an assistant to a director and was just miserable for about a year. Where I was just kind of sitting in this empty office and rolling calls to my boss, you know. But at that point, you know, because I was in LA, I was able to go on meetings. And at this point, I was working not so much with Sue Nagel, but with another agent named Larry Sauls at UTA, who was amazing. He really, really believed in my work. He was super passionate about it. And so he sent me on a shit ton of meetings. And it was just like, I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I would just go on these meetings and just, you know, try to not seem like a complete idiot. And a lot of the meetings were just what they call general meetings, right? Where you go in and you're not there to talk about a specific job or anything. It's just, you're just there to like bullshit for 45 minutes. It's the worst.
That was some of my experiences too when I first moved to LA 7 years ago. I'm now back on the East Coast, but yeah, it's just like meetings, but like what really gets talked about? Not much substance, you know?
No, it's all small talk. I mean, the idea behind it is that, you know, you want to have personal relationships with these executives, because when it's time to staff a show, that, you know, if they already know you and they can sort of put a face to the name and stuff, they will be more likely to, you know, recommend you to a show. But, you know, I don't even know how much that is really true, because when a show gets staffed, it's not necessarily the people who are having these general meetings who are making the decisions. It's a showrunner.
Yeah, right.
As a young, you know, aspiring writer at the time, I did not feel it was my place to say no to any meeting. So I just went on everything and suffered through that. And it took me about a year after I moved to LA to land my first writing job. From the very first day of working on that show, I had a rude awakening. I knew that this was not the job that I had dreamed it would be. I walked in there the first day thinking there was going to be some sort of welcome wagon and that I was gonna be told, you know, what to do and what was expected of me, and meet a bunch of other writers. None of that happened. I walked in there, the offices were like deserted for some reason. I was like, this is like an apocalyptic movie or something. Like, there's nobody here.
So weird.
And there was no morning meeting. There was no meeting of any kind. There, you know, and then I just sat in my office for hours without anybody talking to me or telling me what I was supposed to do. And I have to say that this is the experience that I had in so many jobs that I had in television, where you're just thrown in and nobody tells you anything.
Was that the most surprising thing? Because I think everybody experiences that. You think you're going to get this big orientation, and it kind of produces this environment of fear. I feel like everybody in the industry has experienced it. And, you know, I think talking about it, making sure everybody knows that it's normal, but it's also not okay.
Yeah. Oh no, it was absolutely surprising. It's not just that you're thrown into new jobs without any training or instruction. There's a lack of communication just overall. So even when I was more experienced and I had been working as a writer for many years, I still felt like nobody was telling anybody anything. That's how it is. And it's terrible. It's one of the worst things about the business. And it's one of the reasons I left. You know, I started to get into meditation, and I went on some retreats, like, you know, silent retreats at monasteries and things. And there was a retreat where I went on where everything was explained to me, where like the simplest things were explained, like, you know, like if you were doing kitchen duty, it's like, this is how you cut a tomato. And
wow,
it occurred to me how kind it was, you know, how kind it was to not assume that somebody already knows what they're doing, and to give them this, you know, explanation. And so I realized how fucked up it was that I went through all of those years in television with nobody explaining to me what I was supposed to do, and being expected to know what I was supposed to do.
To me,
Yeah.
that's just obviously bad leadership, because for a show to survive and be good, you would want everybody to be on the same page, no? Like, what? That's baffling.
Also, like the creative process, it's just like, it takes everything that everyone starts in the business for a reason, and then just like all of that is thrown in the garbage, and and it's just like, okay, well, nobody collaborates. It's just kind of a free-for-all.
Also, the point is to have different perspectives to make something all that greater. And if you're just like cutting it off and siloing people, it's like, it's very difficult. But I know that there was a show that you were on that was very different.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I feel so grateful that I had the experience at Freaks and Geeks. If I didn't have that experience, my entire television writing career would have just been nothing but depressing. Not only was the show itself amazing, but the process of, just the whole working environment, the culture at that show was fantastic. It wasn't like a perfect experience. I had some, moments when I was on set and I would do something because, again, no one explained to me what I was supposed to do on set. And then I would get screamed at by a director. But in the writer's room, we had a really great atmosphere where the showrunners, Judd Apatow and Paul Feig, they really cultivated this atmosphere of everybody being able to feel free to be open. Pitch whatever idea. It doesn't have to be a great idea. It doesn't have to be a fully formed idea. Everything was accepted with open arms. And that sort of attitude was very, very rare in my experience. And it was fantastic because what it did was it made all the writers feel really free to be creative. And I feel like that was one of the reasons that show was so great, was because people just felt safe to be as creative as they wanted to be, and to share their own personal experiences to use as material for the show.
It totally translated. I could watch that show over and over and over and over again. Like, it is something that is so dear to me, because of the character development, the realness of it, and the fact that those are things that we all went through. Yeah.
And let me also say that Paul and Judd wanted all of the writers to participate in every aspect of production. So a lot of shows that I worked on, you would never leave the writer's room. But at Freaks and Geeks, they would have us go to the set to supervise the shooting of our episodes. And so we got to collaborate with the director. We got to see how the show was shot. And that really informed the writing, because when we would see what was working on set and what was not working on set, that would translate into the writing. And we got to know the actors and know their real personalities. And that also informed the way that we wrote their characters. So all around, it was just this great experience. And also, if any of those writers were to go on to become showrunners, they would have had that onset experience. They would know what it was like to sit in on an editing session. They would know, like, I remember going to a sound mixing session with Judd Apatow and debating with him about what fart Foley to use for the scene where the character farts. It was the best day ever. I had to pinch myself. I was like, I can't believe I'm getting paid for this. It's so cool. So that's the sort of thing that, I think a lot of people are talking about right now because of, the current strike, writer's strike. One of the things that people are talking a lot about is what's the pipeline to get people to become showrunners? Because in the past, writers would get all of this experience as staff writers. They would get experience with other aspects of production. And so by the time they did rise to the level of showrunner, they had all of this experience and they knew what they were doing a little bit more. Now it's not like that. It's like you said, there's the siloing of these writers. It's like they're, with the shorter streaming seasons. Sometimes writers are not even there at all when their episodes are being shot. Like their job is already over at that point, and they're not around for any of that. So I think it really is important to have writers be involved in other aspects of production, even if you're not like in charge, at least you get to observe how these things are done.
I do editing day to day, and rarely am I asked, would you like to come on set? And I think it's huge to have post be a part of the shoot so that you understand what's going on and what can be fixed before the mistake happens. I really want to dive into what it really is to write a script and go through that process with you mentioned scripts by committee and the note process. Let's really get into that.
So I'll start by saying that writing an episode, and that is not how it is. I mean, obviously, when you are working on a TV show that's in production, the schedule is pretty tight. And so I never had 2 months to write a script. It'd be more like 3 or 4 days. Or a week or something. If that a week is like a luxury. Yeah. So that's the first thing, is the pace of it is extremely fast. And I had to learn how to write fast. And now that I don't have to do that anymore, I realize, wow, I just never liked that. I never have liked having to write that fast. So that's one thing. The other thing is that on a show that is well organized and they have things planned out well, a writer would get to write an entire script by themselves. They would go off for a week, like I said, or, sometimes just a few days, but you would be able to write the whole thing from start to finish and then turn in that draft to the showrunner, and you would get notes on it. And then you would get to write, at least one more draft based on those notes. That's sort of the ideal version of that. But it so often doesn't work that way, or didn't when I worked in TV, and mostly because of the time constraints, because people would procrastinate, or just stuff would just get out of control, and they just didn't have the time to let writers go off and write their own scripts from start to finish. The fast way of writing a script, a first draft, would be to assign each writer on the staff a different scene to write within the same episode. The whole staff would break the story together. There would be an outline created from that. And then these, then each scene would get written by a different writer. I don't think most people know that this is how some scripts are written. It's just so counterintuitive. But
yeah, you would never think that. Yeah,
exactly. But it was done so often. This is the most disturbing part, is that this method of writing a script is called a gangbang. That just goes to show you the sort of like underlying misogyny in the business, that this is like the common term for it. And I never heard anybody even say like, oh, that's gross, or can we think of a different name to call it?
Yeah, nobody said anything, because
nobody said anything.
The way it's been done, and it was built that way strictly for time. Obviously, like each person would write something, and you guys all have to be on the same page as far as tone of voice, et cetera, et cetera. Like
nobody ever felt that they were doing their best work that way.
Right.
And when you're doing it that way, if you're just writing one scene or a couple of scenes from an episode, you don't feel any sort of sense of ownership or connection to the material. And so no one has any real investment in it. So it is amazing to me that any script that is written that way comes out even coherent or cohesive, let alone, a great episode.
Right.
But that is done all the time. I mean, it was done on Friends. Like half the episodes in the season were written that way, or were written in the room as a gangbang. So like you don't even go off and write a scene on your own. It's like everyone is just in the room and they're pitching lines of dialogue or lines of action. And then, the writer's assistant will like type it up in the room. So that's another way that a gangbang is done. And that is also an awful way, in my opinion, to write a script. You have to think really fast and you have to be able to pitch really well in that sort of scenario in order to get any material into the script. And that was another thing that I wanted to mention, is that pitching is such a huge part of being a TV writer. It's not something that I was prepared for. And I had to kind of learn it as I went. When you are, in a writer's room, you so often have to pitch your ideas verbally. If you're not a great pitcher, if you are shy or you're just not a good performer, a lot of times an idea or a joke in the instance of Friends, like I would have a joke that I thought was really funny, and then I would pitch it and I would wreck it in the pitch. That's why the people who work on sitcoms are so often comedians. They are people who go and do stand-up, and they're used to doing that. That's something that they're comfortable with. And those are the kinds of people that succeed in that environment. I had to do so much pitching. By the time I was done with the pitching, I had lost all enthusiasm for the project because I had to pitch it so many times.
Yeah. You lose sight.
And I've been asked, why do you think there's so much pitching? My answer to that is, I think it's because executives don't want to read.
Bingo.
They don't have the time, or they just are too lazy to do it. And so they would rather have a 40-minute meeting with somebody and have that writer pitch them the story than to sit down and read a script or a treatment.
Yeah. And they make the decision right then and there, maybe. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So, the other thing I wanted to talk about was notes, because getting notes is a huge part of the process of being a TV writer. I think getting notes from too many different people can be problematic.
Oh, tell me about it. As an editor,
yeah, it's too many cooks in the kitchen. That's what happens a lot of the time. And there would be so many executives involved that I would get bombarded by notes from all directions, and so often they were contradictory.
Sure. Yep.
And there's no kind of clear chain of command, so you're not sure who to listen to, and so that can be a problem. I think best case scenario, if you're working on a staff, you get notes from one person, and that's the showrunner. And also best case scenario, that person is giving you very clear notes that communicate what they want in a way that is both clear and compassionate. I think I can count on one hand the number of times I got notes like that.
Yeah.
I do remember Judd Apatow would make a point of, like, when he liked something in your script, he would like put a check mark next to it, or maybe he would even write a little note about like how he liked it or something. But it's so rare that you get notes like that.
Yeah. And then, yeah, exactly. And when you do get notes like that, you're like, oh, I'm on the right path here, and I understand why.
Yes, it's not just ego stroking. It's actually really informative. So it can be really helpful to do that part as a group, bounce ideas around. And then, once you get the story broken and you have the scenes that you need to write for it, then that writer would go off and write their script, hopefully have at least a week to write it. But more is better. Turn it in and then give it to the showrunner. The showrunner would read it, give you notes, give you a session where you sit down and you go through the script and you talk about all the elements of it. And you talk about what's working, and you talk about
great.
I know, right? Like, you talk about what's working, what's not working, what you need more of, what you need less of, to really have an in-depth conversation about that. And then also have the showrunner give you the script with very detailed notes written on the script that includes both the things that they love that are working, and the things that need some revising. The notes that the showrunner gives you really should not be line changes. That should be left up to the writer of the episode to do in this stage of the process. They really need to train the writers to write the show. And then once you've trained them, then the whole operation is going to run so much more smoothly. So that's how it would be on an ideal show, and it so rarely happened in any of the jobs that I worked on.
The writing process of a story arc from a cable show back in, 15 years ago, which was like 22 episodes, versus now for streaming, it's like 10 episodes. Can you speak to that about how that's changed the writing process?
On a show that say is 10 episodes, like on Netflix or something like that, what often happens is they put together what's called a mini room. This is one of the points of contention during the strike. They'll hire maybe, one showrunner and then like a couple of writers to break the entire season. So the 10 episode season. And then they'll write all the scripts before the show even starts shooting. And a lot of times this will even happen before there's an official pickup of the show. And the reason that this is so problematic for the writers is that because the show hasn't been officially picked up, they get hired for less than they would if the show were officially picked up. The other problem with mini rooms is that after these writers are done with writing their scripts, they're let go, right? So that it's a very short stint, and then they don't even get to be there for the shooting and the production and the post-production of their episodes. So they don't get any of the experience that you would get if you were working on a show during the production. That is really, really helpful for if you are ever going to become a showrunner yourself, because you need to know all that stuff. And what's happening nowadays is like a lot of, and this happened back then too, a lot of writers get into a position where they're a showrunner, right? Because they've written some great pilot, their show gets picked up, and now they're in a position of running a show, and they've never done this before. And they haven't spent years and years coming up in the business and getting exposed to all of these different aspects of production. So they're completely clueless. They have like these training programs. I think they're like the Writers Guild might have a showrunner training program or something, but I don't know anybody who actually did this training program. It's not something that's really widely done. That's a problem for the future, I think, with these mini rooms, because these writers are just not getting any of that experience. They're not getting any of that training, and there's no pipeline to becoming a showrunner. As a consumer of entertainment, I happen to love shows that are only 10 episodes. I think that so many shows that have a 22 episode season, so many of those episodes are filler. It's just this brutal schedule where you're just constantly having to pump out material. Not all of it's going to be great. So I would rather have fewer episodes of a show and have every single episode be amazing. That's how I feel as a consumer of entertainment. Now, I think, for the people who are working on those shows, that's a whole different thing. They need to figure out, there needs to be a model where they can work on these shorter seasons and still be able to make a living. But I do think that the trend towards shorter seasons, I think is not necessarily a bad one creatively.
Freaks and Geeks, amazing experience. And it sounds like just culturally, spiritually, creatively, it was just an amazing experience all around. And then it kind of continued, your trajectory continued on to other, very well-known shows. And how were those experiences different? And, what did you like about them? What did you not like about them? I guess that's kind of my next question.
I think one thing that was a constant throughout my entire career, this absolute lack of work-life balance. And I want to make sure that I talk about that, because that was the killer. It's so bad for people as human beings, but also as a creative person, as someone who is, creating art, to have that sort of tunnel vision where all you're doing is working. And a lot of times all your entire life is just being in a writer's room. It's unsustainable. You just cannot keep coming up with material if that's all you're doing. You have to have a life if you want to write. So that's something that I think really, really needs to change. And I don't know if it ever will.
I was going to ask because it seems like, I was in a similar situation and I had to leave the job because my daughter was struggling. Unfortunately, I had to stand up for my family, for myself, and say, listen, this is just not working. It was hard because I loved the work and I liked a lot of the people that I worked with. Do you think that there is a solution to that work-life balance? Do you think that it's a possibility, or do you genuinely believe that this is the culture, that's it? Because it seems like other businesses, whether it's corporate America, there is more of just an awareness of people's work-life balance, and whether it's authentic or not, I don't know. What do you think there could ever be a shift with the industry?
Look, I mean, our society is work obsessed just in general, especially in the entertainment business, because the entertainment business is full of people who are super passionate about what they do. Creative people have all had experiences where we're so into something that we're making that we will stay up all night doing it. And that can be an amazing experience. It can be so fun and life affirming to do that. But the problem is when that sort of mentality is imposed upon you and expected of you all the time.
All the time.
That's not sustainable. You can't stay up all night every single night.
And that's not how creatives work. Yeah.
Exactly. You need time to rest. You need time, you need that sort of fallow time where the seeds of creativity get planted, and there's seasons to it. But that's not how the entertainment business works, because it's a business. Things have to be produced on a certain schedule. And that, to me, it was very hard for me to reconcile, with my creative rhythms. I just felt like I was creatively burnt out, and I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to fix that, if I was staying in the business. I worked on a show where this showrunner, she wanted us to be there all the time, even when we had nothing to do. Because her attitude was like, if I'm there, you're there. And she said, never, you are not allowed to make any social plans without running it by me. Yeah, I know. And we were like, what? Really? Like, we would rather just make plans, and then if we have to cancel, we'll cancel. And she goes, no, because then I'm going to feel guilty because you canceled your plans.
But in this gig culture, everything is odd jobs or jobs that last a few days or whatever it is. You're sort of expected to just wait around until something else comes along. Like, I was on a job at NBC and I had finished my edit for the day. It was maybe 4:30 p.m., and I was asking the post producer, I was like, is there anything else that you'd like me to do? And she was like, just wait around. I'm not sure. I have things to do right now. God. So I'll let you know. And I was like, well, I have people at home waiting for me.
Yeah.
I have traffic to get through from Universal City back to the Valley. What?
Mm-hmm. To me, I would much rather be busy and working the whole time than not having anything to do, but being expected to just stay there. That's the worst. That's the worst.
It is.
Like I said, we are such fans of your book and are just enjoying it so much. And we recommend it to our listeners to, anyone in the industry should definitely read the book. Anyone not in the industry should read the book, just to have an insight as to what goes on. And as I'm reading your book, I'm like, oh yeah, that happened to me. And yes, I've experienced that before. Why did you decide this is the time to write this book?
Well, I actually started it a long time ago. So I started it over probably 12 years ago. And I started writing it shortly after I quit the business. And I just felt like I needed to work out some of these, experiences that I'd had, these traumatic experiences, because I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to write again. I mean, that's how beat down I felt after I left the business. And, it's very sad because this is a lifelong passion that I've had. I started writing creative writing when I was in third grade. and loved it, always loved telling stories. And to then get to this point where, you know, after having been a professional writer for 10 years, to feel like I didn't want to write anymore because it was too painful. That was like that was a tragedy. And so I decided, well, I'm going to either have to walk away from this and just find something else to do with my life, or I'm going to, you know, I'm going to try to see if I can get back some of that love that I have for writing. This book was kind of the first attempt at that, to just kind of, you know, process these experiences for myself. And I didn't even know it was a book at first. It wasn't until about 6 chapters in that I had to admit that this was a book. It was so hard to even imagine anyone reading it, let alone publishing it and putting it out into the world, because so many of these experiences were so painful and embarrassing. Like, I was embarrassed. I had a lot of shame around these things, you know, like I felt like it was my fault that I got fired from these shows, or that, you know, I was mistreated. There was a lot of responsibility that I put on myself that was misplaced. It took a lot of therapy and a lot of writing about it to get to a place where I realized this isn't my fault. It's not an isolated incident, you know, like this happens to other people. And it took me a long time before I was even comfortable showing it to anybody. Coincidentally, I feel like it's coming out at like the perfect time. The strike is happening. The 2 strikes are happening. People are talking more about the inner workings of Hollywood. You know, the mythology behind it is starting to be debunked, you know, that this mythology of how it's so glamorous and fun and cool. And, you know, people are starting to become more interested, I think, in how the sausage is made.
I guess my next question is, what do you hope our listeners and any readers take with them from your book?
I know that your listeners are probably more, you know, sort of inclined to, I mean, your listeners are like listening because they want tips and tricks on how to get into the business. And then this episode is like a cautionary tale, you know, it's a very special episode of 101.
It is not all glamour and, you know, amazing experiences and creativity and everyone, you know, it's not, it's gritty. It's hard. People treat you like shit. And they expect you to not only take it, but like stay there and just know
be grateful,
that that's how you,
and be grateful for it.
And there's this also this idea that everybody is just replaceable, which
Yes.
I mean, I find disgusting. And I think having someone like you who has accomplished so much and is now saying like, actually, this was my experience, and you know, it's okay to raise the bar a little bit and hope and change things. And anyone that exploits young people getting into the industry and treating them less than the way they should be treated, it just like, it strikes a nerve for me. And, you know, to proceed with season 3 of our podcast and encouraging young women to go in and go after things without knowing, I feel like it would have been such a disservice for us to do. So we are so grateful that you're joining us.
Oh, no,
but
thank you. Remember that it's just a TV show, you know, or it's just a movie. Like, I know that we care so much about these things and we are passionate, but it's not life or death. and I think that if everybody goes into it with that sort of remembering that, it makes it easier to just navigate, like, you know, some of these situations. You don't have to define yourself by your job, that there's so many ways of finding happiness, and you don't have to like check off all these boxes to be a successful person. I mean, also just for anybody who is determined to go into this business, my advice is always be kind. Like, be kind, don't be an asshole, because the people will remember you if you are kind, you know, and people will appreciate that. And if people are kind and they act in ways that are considerate and thoughtful of other people's feelings on an individual basis, then the culture of Hollywood will improve as a whole.
Patty, this has been such an amazing conversation. Tell our listeners where they can find your book, where they can find more information, like pitch your stuff, pitch yourself. Where can they find all of the things that they should be checking out?
Well, the book is available anywhere books are sold. And if you go into your local brick and mortar bookstore and they don't have the book, you can request it. Also, it's available through my publisher's website, which is zibbybooks.com. And oh, yeah, here's the cover. Woo, got it right here.
Beautiful.
And then you can find more information about me on my website, pattylin.com, PATTYLIN. And you can follow me on Instagram at virtual Patty Lin.
Thank you so much for your time today. We truly enjoyed speaking with you. I feel like I know you so well, even just from reading your book. It's just so personal and inviting. So thank you. You're such a warm, kind person. So.
Oh, thank you. This was really fun. I think what you guys are doing is amazing. And I wish that I had had this resource when I was getting into the business. It would have just been so helpful.
If you're interested in learning more about 101, check out our website, www.101podcast.com.
Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, all at 101 Podcast.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.